Alright, unfortunately the first video, something happened with the camera, I don't know what, so some of this build series did not happen on video. So to recap, basically what you missed was a lot of sanding and a lot of dry fitting. Pretty much followed the instructions exact. So I'm to the point now where I have the forward centering ring, the two guide rails are super glued to the motor mount tube. I put in the eye bolt for the shock cord, and I put just some blue thread locker on there. Not that that's going to matter too much because I'm actually going to put epoxy all over this knot anyway. Tied a couple of half-hitch knots, and then I actually super glued the end of the cord to itself. And then from another video I saw a guy, he decided to use shrink wrap tubing instead of masking tape, which is what the original instructions called for. So I got a nice big long piece of shrink wrap and I just shrink wrap the cord. It helps stiffen it up, which is kind of nice for just packing and everything else, but at the same time it makes sure that this amount of the cord is at least protected from the worst of the ejection charge gases, heat. It is a nylon or polyester shock cord, which means it can and will melt. I don't think the ejection gases, due to the size of ejection charges, yes, the gases will be hot, but it's a pretty small amount. So even with masking tape, it would hold up fairly well for quite some time. The reason instructions have you put the shock cord on now is because once this actually gets glued into the airframe, you're not going to be able to reach down there and get to it. Other than that, I went ahead and weaved the Kevlar onto the aft centering ring so that it can be removed and put back in, which I think it's got to come out at least once. One little note, because I actually ended up doing this 3 times, having to cut the knot and redo it, is when you're weaving, make sure it's not going over the actual fin tabs. I kept screwing that up. I don't think it really matters which direction the rings go. I'm doing it with the actual part number facing outward. And that's the other thing. I sanded the aft ring quite a bit more than the forward ring. The forward ring was actually kind of snug on the motor tube. This one I want nice and loose because I'm going to take it out, internal epoxy everything, put it back in place, and then epoxy all around there. So that's basically the next step, is we're going to shove this whole thing into the airframe, get the tabs lined up. The shock cord out of the way. Honestly, I probably could have used a little less shrink wrap on there just to make it easier to fold the shock cord over into the tube, but it's personal preference. Let's see. I had this all lined up. You do a lot of dry fitting. Dry fit, dry fit, dry fit. A bunch of times. No, that's not right. That's not fitting either. And this is why you dry fit everything so much. Now in Tim's own videos, he actually kind of pushes the 2 rings together, you know, from the inside and from the back. And one thing I just noticed too is that the actual notches in the centering ring for the fins are not the same distance as the actual fin slot. Sorry, that was off camera. Anyway, we're to the point where we're dry fitting all of this, which, as you can see, quite nice. They actually go in pretty smooth. Now the other thing that I did in the instructions was this one back portion right here, this upper tab. This section, like the centering ring, basically this tab right here fits into the centering ring. And he has you kind of round off these back tabs so that when you pull the aft ring out and then put it back in, it slides over those really easily. One other advantage to that is that they go in pretty simply. So pretty much that's this step. You dry fit and everything like crazy, and then some guys prefer to glue the forward ring and all the fins at the same time. His instructions basically say dry fit and assemble everything like it is, and then using a thick super glue, tack the fins down in place, because once those are tacked in place to the airframe, you know, they do make contact with the centering rings. Make sure everything's nice and tight. And then that will allow you to remove that aft ring and do internal epoxy on everything. And I found that on my particular kit, the fins had a little bit of forward back leeway, so I'm going to push them all forward. So yeah, that's where we're at. So since I've got that all fit really well, I'm just going to go ahead and super glue it. I'm using a thick super glue. This actually I got from Hobby Lobby. It's pretty much a knockoff brand of Bob Smith or BSI. Pretty much we're going to glue this all along to probably about 3/4 of the fin. We don't want any glue on the back here because we don't want to accidentally glue in that aft ring yet. I'm just going to put a nice long bead. And I'm pushing on the motor mount and pushing on the aft ring to make sure that fin is nice and snug. This thick super glue typically takes like 5 to 7 seconds to set. I do have some accelerator here. That should pretty much help it set up immediately. Now usually with accelerator what you do is you can spray the accelerator on one surface and glue on the other and then put the two together. There's enough of a gap that it's going to wipe off all that excess. There's enough of a gap that it'll work its way down and get to the actual fin and where the glue is on the fin, I should say. I do have a cradle I made, but it is not big enough for this particular airframe with fins. So I probably shouldn't be letting it sit on that fin, but honestly, if it can handle that little bit of stress, then I know the glue is set and I don't have to worry about it because it's all going to get epoxied here shortly anyway. I'm going to be using West Systems epoxy with a filler. Specifically, I'm using one of their really light or least dense fillers, the colloidal silica. It's pretty good with about all types of bonding and fillet work, and it's really light. Some guys prefer the denser stuff, which, you know, maybe for the external fillets, but internally I don't think it's going to matter. reaching up in here, trying to make sure I get a really good tight bond. That's the thing with that little bit of play on that fin, I don't want it to get off level. Oh, and that's the other thing that happened that I didn't even show you guys. My centering rings, basically I sanded a little too much on the spacer rails, so that when my aft ring goes against the spacer rails, it was just slightly off level. So it hasn't made any effect as far as the way the fins fit, which is good. But mental note, probably take a square and double check all of that stuff before you super glue it. I wish I would have, but I was in a hurry. Because I gotta try to get this done within, got plenty of time. I believe our launch is next weekend, so. There's a lot of people who don't think on high power rockets that you should tack it with super glue first, then epoxy over top. I've seen good arguments both ways. I personally am doing it that way because of time constraints. And then this way, once I get ready to do my epoxy work, I can do it all at once, both internal and external. So, prop that up. Yeah, so as you can see, this is what the rear looks like. And now that those are all pretty much set, pull the aft ring out. See if I can get this camera. And that's what the internal looks like. And pretty much everywhere in there that there is a contact point between cardboard and wood is going to get a fillet of epoxy. Some guys will even fill this section with like a variable density foam. You could do that. It's entirely up to you. I'm not going to. Everything's just going to get a messy internal fillet, and then I'll do external fillets, obviously, in this area, you know, on the fins themselves. So that looks good so far. Let's make sure our ring still fits. I might have to do a little more sanding on that ring, or right here on the tube. The edge of the tube keeps wanting to burr up on me. And you know, honestly, it's all right if the aft ring has a little bit of gap to it when you go to put it in the ring, because you're gonna fill this whole aft end with pretty much epoxy. Obviously the holes where the Kevlar line comes through will get filled when I epoxy all of this. So what will happen now is I'm going to do all my internal epoxy, and once that gets tacky or basically kind of sets up, I'll go ahead and pop this ring in, and same thing, I'm going to do an epoxy fillet all the way around, all across the rear of the fin tabs, these little spots, and then I'll fill these holes as well. And then at that point, I will also use the JB Weld and attach my retainer, which I will show you here in 1 second if I find it. There we go. So I might have to do some more sanding on this tube. I don't want to cram it down on there too tight, but then that'll be the aft retainer. Voila. That's the way that will go together. Aeropack suggests using regular JB weld, mainly because it's high temperature and high pressure capable. I believe the pressures on just the normal JB weld is like 5,000 psi. Yeah, 5,020 psi, and I believe it'll actually go up to 550 degrees Fahrenheit before it's going to start getting compromised. Which I doubt the retainer will ever get that hot. Same thing, if the cardboard tube ever experienced that much pressure or that much heat, it would obviously be on fire. And more than likely it's because you have an engine Kato. So yeah, that would be great. Blow out the rest of the motor tube, but the business end with the retainer would stay intact. That would be my luck. Oh, and this is the cheap motor adapter kit that I got from Apogee. On this, I actually used Gorilla Glue, and I did because Gorilla Glue expands almost 10 to 1. It's activated by water. It is essentially very similar to that density foam or variable density foam, as well as kind of like an epoxy or whatever mixed all together. Gorilla Glue is great for, certain things. These two rings were somewhat loose on the motor tube, which is why I decided on Gorilla Glue. Granted, Gorilla Glue is not as strong as epoxy or anything, but for this, it's literally just to hold a motor in place, a smaller 29mm motor in place. It should be more than fine. But the only time I ever use Gorilla Glue is normally on centering rings, between motor tube and ring and airframe, and it's because it does expand. It will fill all that gap really nicely and make a really nice tight bond. That's not to say that it can't break, because it can and will. I had another rocket that was 29mm, and the thrust ring got blown out when I had an E9 engine go Kato. I glued that thrust ring in with Gorilla Glue, and yeah, that thrust ring is gone. Granted, the rest of the rocket was fine, but so now I just have to friction fit motors in that particular one, or figure out a way to glue a thrust ring back in it, which I'm probably not going to do. I'll just friction fit it. Alright, so this is super glued. Dry fit works good. So the next step is basically all of the epoxy work all in one shot. I will probably, he doesn't instruct you to do an epoxy fillet on the inside here. I will more than likely do one. And that's why some guys glue the motor mount forward ring in place in this particular step. If you put the glue in there with a dowel and then push your motor mount in from the bottom up, what will happen is it will obviously force the glue down the airframe, and it will create a natural fillet along that ring. I'm just going to use a dowel to put a messy fillet in from the top. The biggest concern there is you don't want to accidentally glue your shock ring to the side of the airframe or something like that. And I think that's why the instructions don't actually have you do that. Like I said, they just have you tack everything into place. And now that the fins are tacked to the airframe as well as to the motor mount itself, that ring's not going anywhere and everything's nice and centered up. That allows you to pull that aft ring off, fill it with epoxy, put the aft ring back on and epoxy that. And then, that's going to make sure everything inside is got a good, strong bond. And then you're going to do really good, nice, clean fillets on the outside here, which is where your real strength of your fin bond comes from anyway, is your fillet work. It's not necessarily due to the internal contact of the tab to the motor mount. That is important as well, but it's almost more important to make sure you get really good fillet work. That's where the most of the strength actually comes from. All right, we'll end that one for now, and hopefully I'll see you guys again soon. Okay, real quick, I totally forgot. It is now time to put in the rail buttons now, so that we can epoxy coat them later. They're really simple. It's just a two-part system. It looks kind of like a rivet. I think they're called weld nuts. Put that on, you put the little plastic piece on, the flat bottom goes against the tube, and then a little Phillips head screw goes in there. The plastic rail button part itself is actually recessed, so the screw gets reset into it. But definitely want to do it now, otherwise it'd be a real pain in the butt to try to do them later after you glued everything together. But same thing, we do it now too also, because then on the back side here, on the inside, which you probably can't see, here's the rail button, so just on the inside is the weld nut. As we're doing our internal epoxy work, we can just put a big old glob of epoxy on that too, and then that'll make sure that rail button is permanent. One thing I will say about this being, my first official high-powered kit is, in some ways it's a lot easier because it's so large, like 4-inch diameter tube. You can just reach your hand up in there and do stuff. It's not like working on a little Estes rocket. Biggest consideration and biggest things is, like, even with this step, I was so nervous about it, honestly. The skill level required to build this kit is very simple. It really is. The only reason it's a level 3 or just slightly harder than average or average skill level is because you're going to use epoxy. Really, that's it. Because of that, he's got to up the skill. But other than that, everything has fit together perfectly. I've had no issues with anything, and if you follow the instructions he gives you, yeah, you're pretty much guaranteed success. Obviously, you can go above and beyond what he instructs. I've seen videos where guys have done a lot of work. I've seen videos where they've taken this kit and done tip-to-tip fiberglass and things like that. You could, in theory, actually get your level 2 with this kit as well. I don't know if I would suggest that, but because that would be a pretty high fast flight on a J motor. It's a pretty small light kit. He has other kits that are better for that. I know another guy, same thing, he rounded off all of his fin tips. I do plan on doing that, but not until after I get my certification. I'm not even going to paint and prime this thing yet. I'm going to fly it this weekend, get my certification with it rough, for a couple of different reasons. One, if I have any failures, I don't want to have to, I don't want to spend 3 days finishing it to have a fin break off or a motor KO and crack the airframe and I have to replace all of that work. So I'm going to fly it rough, unfinished, but constructed and functional. Not only that, with the squared off fins and in the rough finish, it's going to create a lot more drag, which means it's going to be a slightly slower and lower flight, because that's the name of the game in certification, is low and slow. You have much better, higher rate of success that way, and you don't have to necessarily walk as far during a recovery. So anyway, rail buttons are installed. I don't have a rail to check them, but I'm pretty sure they're lined up and ready to go, considering they were laser cut holes and everything. Here's my cradle. So, as you can see, and your new cradle for bigger rockets. All right, I'll see you guys next time on the epoxy work.